March 12th, 1943. The night is heavy over the Ruhr Valley. Clouds hang low, glowing faintly with the dull orange of fires still burning from yesterday's raid. Above them, the thunder of Merlin engines rolls through the sky. 30 tons of steel and fuel and men pushing east into German airspace. The Lancaster bombers fly in tight formation, black shapes against a blacker sky. Somewhere in the dark, the enemy is waiting. Inside the lead bomber, sweat beads on the navigator's brow despite the cold. The crew moves with ritual precision, checking gauges, whispering bearings, scanning the void. But there's something in the air tonight, a feeling, a wrongness. Then it begins, a flash, a streak of light. Trace of fire cuts across the night like red needles. The radio explodes with shouting. "Fighter! Starboard! Break!" A tail gunner swings his turret, searching for the unseen hunter, but the German is already there, silent, close, invisible until it's too late. One burst from his cannons, and the Lancaster erupts in flame. From the ground below, the people of the Ruhr look up and see only a falling star. By dawn, 50 aircraft fail to return. 250 men gone in a single night. The survivors land on torn runways across eastern England, engines coughing, paint scorched, eyes hollow. The ground crews watch in silence as the blackened bombers roll in one by one, each one a battered witness to what the airmen are calling the Black Cross Night. At RAF Scampton, among the oil and concrete, a mechanic named Arthur Parnell stands in the glow of a floodlight, staring at the wreckage. A mid-upper turret twisted like paper, a wing pocked with cannon holes. The smell of burned hydraulic fluid fills the hangar. He's seen damage before, but tonight feels different. There's precision to it, purpose. Parnell isn't an officer, not a pilot, not even officially supposed to think beyond the maintenance manual. But he knows machines. He listens to them, and tonight they're telling him something he can't ignore. The bombers are being hunted, not by chance, not by luck, by something unseen. He watches as medics carry stretchers past the hangar door, the faces of men he'd spoken to hours earlier now pale and still. A gunner he once helped fix a jammed turret, a pilot who shared cigarettes on cold nights. They're gone now, and no one can explain how the Germans always seem to find them first. In the officers' mess, the talk is grim. Some blame the moonlight, others new radar traps or improved searchlights. But Parnell's mind latches onto a different idea, one rooted in wires, lenses, and the physics of light. If the Germans can see them in the dark, then the darkness itself must have changed. That night, long after curfew, he walks alone through the rows of sleeping Lancasters. Their black paint swallows the moonlight, their bellies still streaked with soot. He runs a hand along the cold metal, thinking of the men who'll climb back into them tomorrow night. He doesn't see soldiers. He sees targets, blind targets. Inside the hangar, he lingers by a dismantled searchlight, a massive dust-covered thing hauled from storage months ago. Its cracked mirror still catches the faintest glint from a distant bulb. Next to it, a broken infrared filter leans against the wall, a remnant from an abandoned night vision experiment. An idea begins to form. Wild, dangerous, unauthorized. He kneels beside the components, tracing the edges with a mechanic's instinctive understanding. Light the eye can't see, but the world still feels. If it could be focused, captured, amplified, maybe the bombers wouldn't be blind anymore. In the silence of the hangar, Arthur Parnell makes himself a promise. If command can't protect the crews, then he will, even if it means breaking the rules. Outside, the wind sweeps across the Lincolnshire fields. Somewhere far away, another bomber explodes in the night. Parnell doesn't flinch. His eyes stay fixed on the shattered lens in his hand, its fractured glass catching just a glimmer of invisible light. It's the light no one else can see, the one he's going to use to fight back. By spring of 1943, the night war over Europe had become a duel of ghosts. Every mission launched from England vanished into the darkness with no certainty of return. Crews joked that Bomber Command should be renamed the One-Way Service. But no one laughed for long. The Luftwaffe had turned the darkness itself into a weapon. German night fighters, twin-engined Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Junkers Ju-88s were now guided by Liechtenstein radar, a system that could track a bomber miles away, long before any human eye could. Invisible waves pulsed through the air, bouncing back from the British bombers, revealing their exact positions to the hunters waiting above the clouds. The Germans called it Himmelbett, the canopy bed. Each bomber flying into occupied Europe was slipping straight under a blanket of radar beams and radio chatter. To the British air crews, it meant one thing: death could arrive from anywhere, without warning. At RAF Scampton, Arthur Parnell learned to recognize the signs of that invisible predator. He saw the same patterns each morning after a raid: bullet scars at the same angles, fuel tanks punctured with surgical precision, tail sections sheared away as if cut by an unseen hand. The Luftwaffe pilots weren't guessing. They were seeing through the dark. The official reports were clinical, detached. Probable interception due to radar-assisted fighter vectoring. But for Parnell, every damaged fuselage was personal. Each hole in the metal meant another man who might not come home next time. He worked 12-hour shifts, often longer, repairing the same planes again and again. The mechanics called it the circle of ghosts. A plane would go out, come back shredded, get patched up, and go out again, until it didn't return at all. One night, while draining the oil from a scorched Merlin engine, Parnell overheard two air gunners arguing. One swore he'd seen the flash of an enemy aircraft behind them, just for a second, before his guns jammed. The other said there was nothing on radar, nothing at all, until the tracer fire came. That word stuck with him. Nothing. Nothing on radar. Nothing visible. Yet something was out there. Parnell knew enough about electronics to understand the problem. The RAF's radar sets were powerful, but crude, designed for large-scale detection, not for one plane trying to see another in the dark. The Germans had found a new frequency, something finer, sharper, that British countermeasures couldn't jam. He spent his off hours in the maintenance hut, sketching ideas on scrap paper, staring at schematics of the Lancaster's electrical systems. He wasn't an engineer, but he had an instinct for how things talked to one another, how light, current, and magnetism could be bent to human will. That's when he started raiding the scrap bins, disused searchlight mirrors, spare camera lenses from reconnaissance planes, a cracked filter marked infrared, experimental. He scavenged them piece by piece, hiding them behind tool crates at the back of the hangar. His idea was as simple as it was insane. If the Germans could find bombers using invisible waves, perhaps the bombers could turn those same invisible wavelengths into sight. Light that couldn't be seen by the eye, but could be read by a sensor. Officially, no such device existed. Night vision was the stuff of rumor, whispered about among test pilots and lab men at Farnborough. But Parnell didn't care about permission or protocol. He cared about survival. Each night he watched the bombers take off into the darkness. Each morning he watched fewer return. He couldn't stand it any longer. The helpless waiting, the fixing of dead men's planes. He began tinkering after hours, soldering circuits from spare radio parts, mounting lenses onto metal frames, trying to amplify faint traces of infrared light. His hands shook from fatigue, but his mind raced ahead. He imagined gunners looking through the black sky and finally seeing the shape of the hunter before it struck. What he was building was unofficial, unapproved, illegal. But to him, it wasn't rebellion. It was duty. Because if command couldn't see what was killing them, then someone had to. And if no one else would build eyes for the night, Arthur Parnell would. Arthur Parnell's workshop had turned into a graveyard of spare parts and impossible dreams. The mechanics joked that he was building a ghost trap. In truth, that wasn't far off. Every night after official duties ended, he stayed behind, long after the rest of the crew had gone to the mess for tea and cigarettes. The hangar lights dimmed, the concrete floor cold beneath his boots. He worked in silence, guided by the dim beam of a single inspection lamp. On his bench lay an assortment of scavenged components: a cracked searchlight mirror, the eyepiece from a periscope, a cut-down radar tube, and an old rifle-mounted night scope stripped from a damaged commando unit's kit. To most, it was junk. To Parnell, it was the skeleton of a new kind of vision. He called it, half-jokingly, the cat's eye. His idea was simple, if wildly ambitious. By combining an infrared spotlight with a photosensitive tube, he believed he could create a small, directional field of invisible light, one that could reveal aircraft outlines through reflection, even in total darkness. The trick was power. The Lancaster's turret systems already strained under electrical load. Adding another circuit could blow the fuses mid-flight. So he built a makeshift converter from radio parts, feeding the current through a modified transformer, cannibalized from a wireless set. Sparks flew more than once. Once, a capacitor exploded with a crack that echoed across the hangar. Parnell just laughed, wiped the soot off his sleeve, and kept working. By early April, he was ready to test it. He mounted the prototype onto the mid-upper turret of an out-of-service Lancaster, serial number ED 908, a plane slated for scrapping. The cat's eye sat awkwardly beside the gun sight, its cables running like veins across the turret walls. It looked crude, dangerous, and absolutely alive. That was the night his luck ran out. Squadron leader Michael Fairfax walked in during one of Parnell's late sessions, a career officer, clean uniform, every button polished to inspection standard. He froze in the doorway, eyes narrowing at the sight of the gutted turret. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, Parnell?" The air went still. Unauthorized modification of an operational aircraft was a court-martial offense. It didn't matter if the aircraft was grounded. It didn't matter if the intentions were good. Rules were rules. Parnell didn't try to lie. He explained everything: the infrared light, the invisible reflections, his belief that they could see night fighters before radar did. Fairfax listened in stony silence. When Parnell finished, the officer shook his head. "This is lunacy. You'll fry the circuits, blind the gunners, maybe set the aircraft on fire. You're a mechanic, not a scientist." Parnell stood his ground. "Then let me prove it. 1. Flight. No risk to anyone. I'll take responsibility." For a long moment, Fairfax said nothing. Then, against every regulation he'd ever sworn to uphold, he relented. "1 flight," he said. "But if it fails, I'll see you posted to the Orkneys scrubbing seaweed off patrol boats." 2 nights later, the test began. April 2nd, 1943. The sky over the North Sea was a pitch-black dome. The Lancaster, call sign King George, climbed to 10,000 feet, its 4 engines beating a steady rhythm against the wind. Parnell sat in the turret, goggles pressed against his eyes, his makeshift cat's eye humming with faint electrical life. At first, there was nothing, just the endless dark. Then, a shimmer, so faint he thought it might be fatigue. A shape, distant, moving fast. He twisted the turret left, tracking it through the eyepiece. The outline sharpened, a twin-engine aircraft, closing in from above. "Fighter! Port side, high!" he yelled into the intercom. The pilot banked hard. Tracers ripped past where they'd been seconds before. The attacker overshot, invisible to radar, visible only to Parnell's device. They escaped untouched. Back at Scampton, the crew gathered around as Parnell climbed out of the turret, face pale, eyes wide. He said only one thing: It works. Fairfax said nothing for a long time. Then he gave a small, sharp nod. Keep it quiet, he said. From now on, this never happened. But the word spread anyway. In mess halls and hangars across the base, the legend began. The story of a mechanic who built eyes for the night. Point 4. The breakthrough, from rogue idea to secret weapon. 600 words. In the weeks that followed the test flight, the air around RAF Scampton buzzed with quiet rumour. Nobody spoke about Arthur Parnell's cat's eye aloud, not where officers might hear. But the ground crews whispered. Gunners swapped stories. Some claimed they'd seen it themselves. The flash of an enemy fighter caught just in time by a glow that shouldn't have existed. Others swore it was luck, superstition, the kind of story desperate men told to make sense of surviving another night. But the numbers didn't lie. The Lancasters fitted with Parnell's improvised device, only 3, built in secrecy, were coming back with fewer holes, fewer burned-out turrets, fewer missing crews. Something about the system worked, even if no one understood how. Squadron leader Fairfax, once ready to have Parnell thrown off base, began sending quiet reports to Group Command. They returned, stamped confidential. Parnell was told to cease modifications immediately, but the raids kept coming, and the men kept dying. Orders became suggestions. Suggestions became silence. By May, word of the unauthorized innovation reached Farnborough, the Royal Aircraft Establishment. The technical branch sent an observer, Flight Lieutenant Peter Hammond, an engineer with the kind of clipped accent that made every word sound like a rebuke. He arrived expecting to confiscate the device, shut the whole thing down, and remind the men at Scampton that inventions were not their business. Hammond's expression said as much when he first saw the cat's eye. The cables were held together with electrical tape. The control box bore scorch marks. The turret's sighting scope was bolted in with spare parts from a coffee grinder. This, Hammond said flatly, is not standard procedure. Parnell met his gaze, grease-stained hands steady. Standard procedure doesn't work anymore. The test flight that followed changed everything. That night, Hammond climbed aboard one of the modified Lancasters with Parnell. The target, Dortmund. The mission, standard bombing run, heavy flak expected. As they crossed the Dutch coast, the crew went silent, eyes scanning the void. Then it happened. Again. A faint heat shadow on the horizon. Through the cat's eye, Parnell saw the fighter closing in, invisible to radar. He called out the direction. The gunners swung their turrets, ready before the attack began. A burst of 303 fire arced into the dark. Seconds later, a faint flash. A German night fighter spiraling downward, its own engines aflame. Hammond said nothing during the return flight. But when they landed, he didn't leave the plane for several minutes. He just sat, staring at the crude metal box that had changed what he thought possible. Within a week, Parnell was ordered to report to Farnborough. He feared arrest. Instead, he found himself in a clean laboratory, his rough sketches laid out on a polished table. A colonel in the signals branch asked him to explain, in plain language, how he'd managed to see the invisible. Parnell did. Slowly, methodically, without pride. He described how heat from an engine or exhaust could be made visible through infrared light, how lenses could capture that reflection, and how amplification through a cathode tube could create a faint but readable image. The officers listened. When he finished, the colonel smiled. "You realize you've just built a crude version of something we've been trying to perfect for 2 years. They called it Operation Darklight. Under military secrecy, Parnell's device was refined into a more stable prototype, smaller, safer, using purpose-built components instead of scrap metal. Engineers from the telecommunications research establishment in Malvern joined the effort. They tested the improved units on new Lancasters under controlled missions, tracking targets by heat and silhouette rather than radar echo. For the first time, the bombers were not entirely blind. Within Bomber Command, the results were undeniable. Squadrons equipped with the new sensor systems reported improved interception avoidance and a measurable drop in loss rates. The official reports credited enhanced tactical awareness. Unofficially, they all knew who had given them that awareness. Arthur Parnell, the mechanic who broke the rules, was quietly promoted to Technical Flight Sergeant. His invention became property of the Crown, filed under restricted access and buried under layers of classification. No public commendation, no medal ceremony, just a handshake from a senior officer and 3 words spoken with genuine respect. You saved lives. Back at Scampton, the hangar felt emptier without him. But every time a Lancaster roared into the night, its crew carried with them a piece of his defiance, a light built not for glory, but for survival. And somewhere in the darkness over Europe, the hunters began to realize that their prey could now see them coming. July 24th, 1943. The humid air over Lincolnshire trembles with the roar of engines. One after another, the Lancasters rise from the runways, black silhouettes climbing into a twilight sky streaked with smoke. The target, Hamburg. The operation's codename is Gomorrah. It is to be the largest night raid in history. 700 bombers striking the heart of Germany's industrial north. For Bomber Command, it's more than another mission. It's a test of faith, a gamble to prove that the tide of the night war can finally turn. And among the first wave are 3 aircraft fitted with a new secret device, the refined descendant of Arthur Parnell's cat's eye. Parnell stands on the tarmac as they taxi past, the ground rumbling beneath his boots. He watches the crews wave through their cockpit windows, young men with calm faces masking fear, the engines thunder, the smell of fuel and oil filling the air. He feels pride and dread. He knows what waits for them beyond the North Sea. Radar-guided flak, searchlights, the lurking fighters of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1. But tonight, the British bombers are not flying blind. High above the clouds, as the Lancasters reach cruising altitude, the city lights of occupied Europe flicker below like dying embers. The gunners scan their scopes, black and white tubes fed by the new infrared sensors mounted beneath their turrets. Through them, the darkness is no longer empty. Shapes emerge, thin heat signatures of aircraft miles away, faint glows where exhaust burns against the night air. The lead bomber's rear gunner whispers into the intercom. Contact, port side, high. The pilot banks left. A German Ju-88 flashes past, so close they can see its underbelly. The fighter fires too late, missing its mark. A second later, the gunner opens fire, and the night explodes in red arcs. The hunter becomes the hunted. For the first time in months, the bombers have an edge. Back at Scampton, Parnell paces the hangar floor, chain-smoking cigarettes he doesn't even taste. Each minute drags like an hour. The radio room crackles with coded transmissions, weather reports, course corrections, snippets of garbled Morse. Then silence. Always silence. He knows that silence means only 2 things, either success or death. Hours pass before the first faint sound of returning aircraft reaches them, a deep, rolling hum across the countryside. 1, then 3, then 10. By dawn, nearly all of the modified Lancasters have returned. The crews climb down, faces ash-grey, eyes wide, alive. Their reports spread through the base like fire. The new system, now codenamed Infrared Visual Aid Mackay, had warned them of approaching fighters again and again. Crews had dodged attacks, returned fire first, or slipped through radar zones undetected. The losses were the lowest of any major raid since the war began. But the story doesn't end there. Over Hamburg, the Germans had seen something they didn't understand. Radar operators reported phantom blips vanishing from screens. Pilots described bombers that moved like shadows, and knew where we were before we fired. Fear crept into the Luftwaffe's night ranks, the sense that the British had found a way to fight back in the dark. On the ground, Hamburg burned. The firestorm reached 1,500 degrees, consuming entire districts. The devastation was horrific beyond measure. Yet for the men who flew through that inferno, there was one flicker of redemption. They had survived where, months earlier, they would have died. When the survivors gathered at Scampton, they found Parnell waiting beside the hangar doors. No uniform ceremony, no salutes, just nods between men who understood what had changed. One pilot, his face still blackened with soot, clapped him on the shoulder. "She's a bloody miracle, that thing of yours," he said. Felt like we had eyes for the first time. Parnell didn't smile. He only looked toward the horizon where the bombers had vanished hours earlier. "It's not a miracle," he said softly. "It's a beginning." And in that beginning, something fundamental shifted. The RAF had entered a new phase of warfare, where invention, not numbers, would decide who ruled the night. What had started as an illegal modification by a single mechanic had now become a weapon of survival. And from that night on, the darkness no longer belonged solely to the hunter. When the Battle of Hamburg ended, the devastation stunned the world. Newspapers carried headlines about the firestorm, the unprecedented scale of destruction, the staggering cost on both sides. But within the walls of RAF Bomber Command, attention turned to something quieter, almost invisible, the survival rates. For the first time in months, the numbers told a different story. More crews had come home than anyone dared hope. The cause, officially, was listed as improvements in night tactics and coordination. Unofficially, every man at Scampton knew better. Arthur Parnell's device, no longer the cobbled-together cat's eye, but a refined military-grade infrared detection system, had tipped the balance. Yet instead of fame, what followed was silence. 2 weeks after the raid, Parnell received a sealed envelope ordering him to London. No explanation, no congratulations, just a destination and a time. He packed his duffel, cleaned the grease from his hands, and boarded a military lorry bound south. The city was still shrouded in blackout when he arrived at the Air Ministry's technical branch. Inside, the world was different, sterile, bright, humming with quiet authority. Men in suits, not uniforms, greeted him with guarded nods. One of them, an older officer with a thin moustache, gestured him into a room with a single desk and a folder waiting on top. "Sergeant Parnell," the officer began, "your recent modifications have come to our attention." Parnell braced for reprimand. Instead, the officer continued, "We've reviewed your reports and flight outcomes. It seems your system provided an operational advantage. The Air Council considers it significant." Then, almost as an afterthought, "However, the matter is to remain classified under the Official Secrets Act. You are not to discuss your work outside approved channels." Parnell frowned. "So, that's it? No project? No rollout?" The officer smiled without warmth. "Oh, there'll be a rollout, Sergeant. But you won't be the one leading it. The scientists at Malvern and Farnborough will take it from here. You'll be reassigned to technical command. Quiet work, no publicity." He slid the folder across the desk. Inside lay a single citation, unsigned, for exceptional technical service in support of operational readiness. A note at the bottom read, "Award to be recorded without citation detail." It was recognition, but only in the most bureaucratic sense, a ghost of the glory his work deserved. That evening, Parnell walked through London's darkened streets, the Thames glinting faintly beneath the blackout lamps. He passed newsstands shouting headlines about Britain's triumph in the skies. None of them mentioned him. None ever would. But he wasn't angry. Not really. He had known from the start that what he built wasn't meant for applause. It was meant to keep men alive. Back at Scampton, his absence was felt immediately. Mechanics missed his late-night humming, the way he'd run a hand along the cold skin of a bomber before a mission as if it were a living thing. The gunners, the flight crews, they kept the secret, even among themselves. They called it the ghost light, a term that carried through the rest of the war. By early 1944, the ministry's engineers had integrated his concept into new systems, more compact, more stable, disguised under code names and technical jargon. Some were used in Pathfinder squadrons. Others became the foundation for airborne interception aids, bridging the gap between radar and visual sighting. When Parnell received his promotion papers, he found a small note tucked into the envelope, unsigned. "Your work continues, even if your name does not. History will remember the results." He folded the paper, tucked it into his pocket, and returned to his post. No ceremony, no announcement. Just another day's work for a man who'd already changed the night war forever. As the months rolled on, the RAF's bombers began to strike deeper, fly longer, and survive more often. The Luftwaffe's night defences faltered, their pilots complaining of ghost bombers that seemed to slip through radar nets and vanish into the dark. Few in command ever spoke of the mechanic who made that possible. Fewer still even knew his name. But every pilot who climbed into a Lancaster fitted with the new detection system carried unknowingly the legacy of one man's defiance, an act born not from authority, but from necessity. Arthur Parnell had been silenced by secrecy, but his creation spoke for him every night over Europe, in the quiet hum of circuits, in the faint glow of hidden light, in every bomber that came home when it wasn't supposed to. The war would rage on, the rules would tighten, but the darkness would never again belong solely to the enemy. When the war finally ended in 1945, Britain celebrated its victory in the streets, bells ringing, lights blazing for the first time in 6 long years. Cities that had known only blackout and silence glowed again. Yet in the quiet corners of Lincolnshire, a few old airmen raised a glass not to generals or politicians, but to the ones no one spoke of, the ones who had fought their wars in shadows. Arthur Parnell was among them. He left the service with little fanfare, no parade, no public record of what he had done. His citation, still redacted, offered only a vague line about technical contribution to aerial defense. He packed his few belongings into a small wooden trunk, a worn spanner, a grease-stained notebook full of sketches, and the cracked infrared lens that had started it all. Then he went home to Leeds, where the streets were crowded with demobilized men trying to start over. He found work easily. The Taylor and Hobson camera works needed skilled engineers to rebuild their optical systems for peacetime production. Parnell never mentioned his wartime experiments, but his understanding of lenses and light drew quiet respect from his colleagues. He spent his days calibrating cameras, testing film exposure, tinkering with focus. To them, he was just another quiet genius who preferred machines to conversation. But sometimes, late in the evenings, when the factory lights dimmed, he would stay behind, alone again at a workbench. He'd take out a piece of glass, hold it up to the lamp, and study how the light bent through it, always searching for what lay just beyond visible sight. The world moved on. Radar became commonplace. New generations of night vision equipment appeared, smaller, faster, sharper. The Koreans, the Vietnamese, and later the NATO pilots of the Cold War all used technologies that could trace their roots back to a mechanic's illegal mod in 1943. Yet his name appeared nowhere in the histories. The secrecy of the project buried him under layers of classified archives. To the RAF, Operation Darklight was simply one entry among thousands of wartime experiments. To Arthur Parnell, it was a memory that would not leave him, the hum of engines, the fear in men's eyes, the knowledge that something he had built in defiance had saved them. He never married, never sought medals. He lived a life of small routines and quiet habits. But the men who had flown with his invention remembered. When they gathered at reunions in the 1950s, his name came up in hushed tones. The man with the eyes, they called him. One of those men, Group Captain Michael Fairfax, visited him in 1958. By then, Fairfax had gone grey, but his voice was the same clipped tone that once ordered missions over Germany. They sat in Parnell's small kitchen, tea steaming between them. "You know," Fairfax said softly, "there's talk now of integrating full night vision systems into jet bombers. The scientists call it thermal imaging, but I told one of them the truth." Parnell raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "That it started with a mechanic in a hangar who refused to let darkness win." For a long time neither spoke. Then Parnell smiled, the faintest, saddest smile. "It was never about the darkness," he said. "It was about the men inside it." Years later, when he passed away quietly at his workbench, the obituary in the Yorkshire Post described him only as Arthur James Parnell, engineer and craftsman, aged 57. There was no mention of the war, no hint of the light he'd built in the dark. But history, in its slow and patient way, remembers differently. Declassified documents decades later would reveal fragments of his story. Technical memos signed A.J. Parnell, sketches of infrared circuits labelled Cat's Eye. Historians pieced together what had once been secret, how a mechanic's defiance had altered the course of the night war, and how his ideas had become the foundation of modern night fighting and reconnaissance. He was never a commander, never a scientist, never supposed to change anything. And yet he did, because Arthur Parnell believed that even in war's deepest darkness, men deserved a way to see. In a conflict fought in shadows, he built a light no one was supposed to see. He wasn't ordered to do it. He wasn't allowed to do it. He simply refused to let darkness win. And for every airman who came home through the black skies of Europe, that defiance was the difference between vanishing into night and living to see dawn.